ABC presents Thursday Night Special.
I'm happy tonight. I'm not worried about anything. I'm not fearing any man.
Who killed Martin Luther King Jr.? Dr. King, as you already know, is the most eloquent and effective civil rights spokesman in our history until he was shot dead on a motel balcony in Memphis, Tennessee 9 years ago. The night before his assassination, Dr. King gave a speech that was a chilling premonition of his own death.
Began to talk about the threats that were out. What would happen to me from some of our sick white brothers. Well, I don't know what will happen now, but it really doesn't matter with me now because I've been to the mountaintop. I don't mind. Like anybody, I would like to live a long life. Longevity has its place. But I'm not concerned about that now. I just want to do God's will. And He's allowed me to go up to the mountain. And I've looked over. And I've seen the promised land. I may not get there with you. But I want you to know tonight that we as a people will get to the promised land. So I'm happy tonight. I'm not worried about anything. I'm not fearing any man. Mine eyes have seen the glory of the coming of the Lord.
Our first guest this evening is the comedian, social activist, humanitarian, and old friend of Dr. King, Dick Gregory, and an old friend of mine.
Fine. God bless you.
Bless you.
God.
Welcome. How do you feel when you see that?
God, what can you say? I've reflected many times on, what we really lost. Not what he meant on television, but quietly in talking to you. It was never honky or those white folks, of which many of us black folks feel we have to do to communicate with our brothers and sisters. And he never said nothing with you quietly about that whole movement that he couldn't say it on worldwide television. That never changed. There was a piece about him in the midst of all the nonsense. And I never understood it then. I know it now. In St. Louis, Missouri, they named a street after me. Dick Gregory Place runs into Martin Luther King Drive. And I go back and I look at that because that's the story of my life. I bumped into King and it changed my whole life. Last year I ran from Los Angeles, California to New York City. Not one insult. At no time was my life endangered at all. Martin knew that 10 years ago that there will be a day when you as a black human being with a white or another black human being can go all the way across this country. And that was the peace that he had. He knew, and we didn't know where it was going. I know now that America is mature enough to accept all types of truths, although we don't want to deal with the truth, but when the truth is presented to us, we can handle it, and he knew that, and that I didn't know.
How did you get involved in this inquiry, the reinvestigation of his assassination?
When Mark Lane called me and said, I have something I want you to hear, and when I listened to Mr. Murdoch, I knew that was the connecting point. I knew that was the one thing that would get it over.
It's a former FBI agent that we'll be speaking with, Arthur Murtaugh, later on in the program. Dick mentions Mark Lane. He is the co-author with Dick Gregory of a book on the King assassination. The book is called Operation Zorro. Mark Lane, who I'm sure you all know, is no stranger to this program. He's a veteran conspiracy investigator. He is an attorney. He is an author and another friend. Hi, Mark.
Hi, how are you, Geraldo? Thank you again for raising this question when it has to be raised in America.
I have to say that we have moved heaven and earth on this program, trying to get an official spokesman from the Department of Justice to come on to contradict some of the things that you are about to hear from Mark and Dick and Arthur Murtaugh, the FBI agent. The people at the Department of Justice, specifically Michael Shaheen, told us that they rely entirely on this official report of the Department of Justice Task Force to review the FBI Martin Luther King Jr. security and assassination investigations. And Mark, before we start, I want to read some of those official conclusions into the King assassination. I'm quoting from page 64. In all the years following the assassination, the FBI investigation has failed to reveal any connection between any alleged conspirators and James Earl Ray, including those alleged by Ray himself. Moving on to recommendations on page 143. The task force does not fault the technical competence of the investigation conducted into the death of Dr. King. We found no new evidence which calls for action by state or federal authorities regarding the King assassination. First of all, I'd like you to reply to the official position.
The official position that the FBI in all of these years has not found any additional evidence regarding the death of Dr. King is understandable when one looks at all of the evidence, which I think establishes beyond question that people employed by the Federal Bureau of Investigation must be considered to be prime suspects in the murder of Dr. King. Therefore, to allow a group in the Atlanta office called the Destroy King Squad, established by Mr. Hoover to destroy Dr. King, to conduct basically the entire investigation into the murder of Dr. King is to say that we don't really expect to find out anything from them. And the conclusion that the task force of the Department of Justice has found no additional evidence, I think that's probably true, and that's because if you read the opening of the task force report, it states that that was not their job. They were just going to look into and see how the FBI did. In any event, I think what is so clear now with the Gallup poll showing that 11% of the American people believe that Oswald did it alone, 18% of the American people believe that James Earl Ray did it alone. What is required for the American people is not another Warren Commission report, a sealed volume with conclusions, but the evidence unfolded before our eyes so the American people can see the evidence and reach their own conclusions. And that's what we have all been calling for all these years. Unfortunately, Congress is now moving in that direction.
Okay, Congress is moving in that direction, but set the scene for our viewers tonight. Martin Luther King is in Memphis, Tennessee. There's a sanitation strike. He's gone to support the sanitation workers in their struggle. He's staying in a place called the Lorraine Motel.
Yeah, why was he there, first of all?
Okay, it's April 1968. Take it from there.
All right, he had been there in March 28th, to lead a nonviolent demonstration, which was what he always led, of course. That was turned into a violent confrontation. We now know was done by agent provocateurs associated with the Federal Bureau of Investigation, who turned a nonviolent march into a violent confrontation with the Memphis police. And in the melee and in the actions that followed, one young black man was shot to death. Many, many people were maced. I think it was the first time mace was used against Americans in the streets of our cities. And Dr. King, therefore, was compelled to return.
All right, so he's in the Lorraine Motel. I also have to add, in fairness, because I have to play the part of devil's advocate to the extent that the official people have refused to come on the program. They say that their investigation concludes that the FBI did, in fact, have a, quote, destroy King squad that we'll be getting into, but they say that they can take no criminal action against anybody responsible for those actions because the statute of limitation has passed, or the guilty people, rather, have either died or retired, and that the only people left in the FBI who could be held responsible, at least administratively, it would be unfair because they were only taking orders from their superiors. The report also says that the FBI is cleared of any criminal involvement in the King death. I just have to say that as a matter of record.
Sure, they cleared themselves. There's no question about that. They said that there was no involvement, but I think the Congress, in looking at the facts, may come to a different conclusion.
Let's talk about the facts now.
All right, now we have Dr. King in place at the Lorraine Motel.
He has a 10-man security squad.
Yeah, at one point, and then it was reduced to 2 men. The man in charge is Ed Reddit, black detective. He's there because Reverend Billy Kiles, who was Dr. King's host, asked that Reddit be in charge of security. He's there. At 4 o'clock in the afternoon, Lieutenant Arkin, the head of the Domestic Intelligence Squad, the Memphis Police, drives up and says to Reddit, Holloman has to see you at once. Holloman was the director of fire and police in Memphis, the only man ever to have been the director of both, and he just came in a short time before then. He, incidentally, had been a high-ranking official, Mr. Holman had, in the FBI for 25 years. In fact, he had been the chief inspector who personally ran Mr. Hoover's office for 8 years prior to this time when he took over this new job. Holman called and read it, and he said to Reddit, "You see this gentleman? This man is from the United States Secret Service. He's just flown down from Washington because it's a death threat against you. A group in Mississippi has conspired with people in Missouri, and they're here in Tennessee with guns looking for you. So I'm putting you at home." Reddit protested, but he was taken home. And he kept on saying, "But I'm in charge of security. There's only one man there. He won't be able to do anything without me." And the answer was, "This is a direct order." And while Reddit was in his car in front of his house saying, "Can't I go back? This is a delicate time. Dr. King will be leaving the Lorraine Motel," they heard on the radio that Dr. King had been shot.
Okay, summing up again. A 10-man security force cut down to 2 men. One of the 2, Detective Ed Reddit, is taken off the case.
He was the man in charge.
He was the man in charge, okay? We have a brief film clip now I'd like you to see, ladies and gentlemen. It was an interview conducted by ABC correspondent Gil Noble and Detective Ed Reddit. The question asked of Detective Reddit is, why do you think you were taken off the case?
I think because whoever pulled the trigger, I could identify.
That was Detective Ed Reddit, who was chief of Martin Luther King Security Detail in Memphis before he was removed from the case. Now, Mark, you spoke with the alleged assassin, James Earl Ray himself. Here's the interview.
Dr. King was killed at about 6 o'clock. What time did you first get to the room?
I would say about 4 o'clock, maybe a few minutes before 4.
Do you recall where you were when Dr. King was killed?
Well, we've made investigations, statements, and interviewed various witnesses and things like that. We tried to pin down just where I was at, and I was most likely was either in a service station or just leaving it. And I was in various different places running errands between 4 and 6 o'clock. I think at this particular time we're referring to that I had a flat tire the night before that, and these parties, person I was with was, excuse me, was supposed to use the auto that night, and I was going to get it serviced and everything ready. And I think that's when the shooting took place.
What did you do after you had the tire fixed and you went back toward the motel?
Yes, I believe I ran into a roadblock. I noticed a lot of police in the area, and the police cars blocking off the area. And I'm not positive. One of them may have waved me off, but I do recall police in the area, and I went the other direction naturally.
Why naturally?
Well, at the time I was a fugitive from Missouri, and it wouldn't have made any difference anyway. I would still left the area if police were in the area.
And how did you first learn that Dr. King had been shot?
I would guess on the radio approximately 20 minutes later. I was heading towards New Orleans.
What did you hear?
I think there was a report that he'd been shot, and I didn't pay too much attention to that. And I'd say 15 or 20 minutes later, there was a report that they were looking for a white Mustang, which did...
And what did you decide to do at the time?
Well, at the time, before I heard about the Mustang, I was going to New Orleans where I had some contacts and possibly make a phone call. And after I heard about the looking for the Mustang, I had to make certain assumptions that they were looking for me. And instead of going to New Orleans, I went to Atlanta, Georgia.
Did you pull the trigger on the rifle to kill Dr. King?
No, I didn't. No.
That from James Earl Ray. Stay with us. We're about to be joined by a former FBI agent who will be telling us about an awful creation of J. Edgar Hoover's. It was called the Destroy King Squad. That, then more on the murder of Dr. King after this. Dick Gregory, Mark Lane, and I have been joined by a retired special agent for the FBI. His name is Arthur Murtaugh. He joined the Bureau in 1951 and served as a special agent until his retirement in 1971. He now practices law and is an associate professor of criminal justice at Clarkson College in upstate New York. Arthur, welcome on the program. What exactly was your assignment at the FBI?
I was a special agent in the FBI for 20 years in different parts of the country. I spent the last 11 years in Atlanta.
All right. Did you witness or participate in any efforts by the FBI to discredit Dr. King?
I did not participate in them, but I was aware about 1962 that a very carefully orchestrated vendetta had been organized to discredit Dr. King. The history of this goes back to the activities in Albany, Georgia, where Dr. King made some criticism of the Bureau, and from that time on there was more time spent in connection with discrediting Dr. King, at least in the Atlanta office, than there was on all the rest of the security work put together.
Was there a Destroy King squad?
Well, the squad, I remarked just before coming on that it probably would be better not to use the term Destroy King squad. It wasn't called that. Its purpose certainly was to destroy King. It was called, like any other squad, it was a security squad of the Atlanta office. And everything they did, or most of what they did, was designed to discredit Dr. King.
Like what?
Well, like keeping a wiretap on him for many years, and taking the information off the wiretap, anything that was unfavorable, and attempting to peddle it to newspapers throughout the country and get it published. This was a procedure that went on day after day, and it was open. Everybody in the office, I think, knew it. I knew it, and I'm sure most other people knew it.
How do you feel about that now?
Well, I feel the same as I did then. I think it was a miscarriage of justice, and it should have been stopped.
Where were you when Dr. King was shot?
I was in the office in Atlanta, just getting ready to sign out to go home.
What was the response of some of your colleagues?
As we were walking out about 10 minutes to 7 or 5 minutes to 7, we heard on the radio that played in the office the news of Dr. King's death, and of the news that he had been shot. And at that, this fellow who was a squad member and an agent literally jumped up and down with glee, and he well, I wouldn't want to demonstrate it, but he actually physically jumped off the ground and said, "I'm glad the son of a bitch, I'm glad they got him, I hope the son of a bitch is dead." And a few minutes later, while we were signing out, the news came over that Dr. King had been killed, and he went through the same antics of, "I'm glad he's dead," and so on. Now, I walked with him from down to where we parked our cars, and I talked with him, and I said, "I don't understand your attitude." And he went on to explain to me that he thought Dr. King was a threat to the security of the United States, and that he was happy that he was dead, period.
Do you think that that was a prevalent mood within the Bureau?
I think that the Bureau, the agents that I knew that worked in, particularly in the security area, due to the system of selection of agent personnel, there had been a group of agents selected that were, for the most part, extremely rightist in their thinking. Many of them were radicals on the right, and I'm as opposed to radicals on the left as I am to radicals on the right. But many of these people were radicals on the right, and they were racist-oriented, and they fed the system that Hoover wanted in the effort to destroy King, yes.
Is it possible, in your mind, that as Mark and Dick suggest in their book, the FBI or members of the Bureau, past members, deceased or living, could or can be considered suspects in the assassination of Dr. King?
Of course. No question about it whatsoever. Now, I wouldn't want to thrust suspicion on all FBI agents by any manner or means, but I knew agents that I would not trust in a circumstance involving the security of a person like Dr. King. I knew agents who hated and said so openly. Okay. I recall an incident where an agent came in on the investigation where the civil rights workers were buried in Philadelphia, Mississippi, and a fella came in, and I was sitting waiting to get into the inspector's office to get my instructions, and I was sitting talking to this fellow, and I said, what do you think about the death of these civil rights workers? And he was an agent, a man 40 years old. He said, I told the inspector a few minutes ago, when I heard about the killing of those 3 civil rights workers, if they are killed, and it isn't some kind of a ruse, I told him a thrill of joy went up my spine. Now, there were that kind of people in the FBI. Not very many, you see, but enough to, in my judgment, make it very plausible that somebody in the FBI could have leaked information and could have assisted in an assassination plot against Dr. King. I don't mean to say that I know that they did. I'm just saying that it should be investigated.
Yeah, I agree with you. Stay with us. Let's take a commercial break. We'll be right back after this. We're back. My guests are Mark Lane, Dick Gregory, and Arthur Murtaugh, a retired FBI agent. And Dick and Mark, I want you to comment and respond to what you've heard Arthur just say.
You know, I said earlier that I think America is mature enough to deal with the truth, and I just say that, you know, if my father was an FBI agent and all the publicity coming out on the FBI, I would feel much better tonight after knowing that there's some Arthur Murtaughs around with the FBI. And I think that it is this type of individual that will overshadow all the wrongs of this nation and various organizations if, like he said, happened, if they can be cleaned out at the top. And I love you, and I thank God we have people like you.
Mark?
Well, hearing Mr. Murtaugh again is just a chilling experience to think of what was taking place when you compare the speech that Dr. King made with what people in the FBI were thinking about him. I don't know how anyone in Congress could hear Arthur Murtaugh and not say this must be investigated thoroughly. And we are all of us are really grateful.
I learned in 1958 when a man who at that time was, or right after that time became an assistant director, he said to me in connection with the matter, he said, Art, you want to get this information to Mr. Hoover. And he said, I know you're right, and I know that what you're saying is of good principle and so forth, and I admire a man of good principle. But he said, you've got to make up your mind that we don't have any place for people of principle in the FBI. And you're either going to have to give up your principles or get out of the FBI. And I told him at that time, I said, no way am I going to get out of the FBI. I'm going to stay in, and I'm going to find out what's wrong with the FBI, and at the opportune moment, I'm going to do something about it.
Arthur, I want to quote again from the Department of Justice Task Force official report. Quote from page 63. Based on our review of the files, the task force is satisfied that the FBI did a credible and thorough job in attempting to identify any possible conspiracy or persons who could have been involved in the murder. Do you think it's possible that the same people, the same personalities who were involved in the FBI's efforts to discredit King could have conducted a thorough and credible investigation of his assassination?
I certainly do not think that they could.
For instance, the gentleman that you said was in the Atlanta office when you were, who jumped for joy at the news of Dr. King's death, was he involved in the subsequent investigation?
Yes, he had I think there weren't very many agents involved in the actual investigation. Probably, a lot of them had leads. Probably 8 or 9 actually shaped up the investigation in Atlanta, and he would have been one of those 8 or 9.
Incredible. I hope Congress is listening. Our next guest will be Congressman Walter Fauntroy. He's the U.S. representative from Washington, D.C. He was formerly a close associate of Dr. King, and he was also one of the organizers of the historic March on Washington in 1963. Congressman Fauntroy co-sponsored the congressional resolution that called for the establishment of a House Assassination Committee, and he's now chairman of the Martin Luther King Jr. Assassination Subcommittee. Congressman, thank you very much for coming on the program. Why don't we start with your bringing us up to date. What is the status of the congressional inquiry right now into the assassination of Dr. King?
We are pursuing 2 lines of inquiry. First, we are reviewing all available data on investigations conducted by state, local, and federal authorities on the matter. And then secondly, we're pursuing previously unpursued leads, and some new leads that have come to us since we've begun the investigation.
What do you think about the evidence contained in the Gregory Lane book?
Well, quite frankly, it was astounding evidence, and it was that evidence which prompted me to move in the House to sort of reopen the whole question. In March of 1976, the whole question of an investigation had sort of failed in the Rules Committee, but once I had gained access to this information and moved around the Hill talking to leadership, we decided to open the question again, and that resulted in the committee being established.
Tell me frankly what the sentiment is in Congress. Do you think a meaningful search for the truth is possible?
I think a meaningful search for the truth is possible, and that, in fact, we're going to find out the truth. I believe that. I have been somewhat puzzled by the attitude I found among some people on the Hill and in the country at large that seem to say, leave it buried, we don't want to know. I think we're going to know. Dr. King used to say, truth crushed to earth will rise again. I think it's going to rise, and this committee will preside over the resurrection of it.
I certainly hope so. Congressman, thank you very much for coming out. Now, even if we take as an established fact that James Earl Ray was a raging bigot whose blind hatred of the civil rights movement knew no rational bounds, and even if we conclude that Ray had a wild yearning for recognition, as some of the official historians say, and even if we find that Ray thought he could earn instant money from some grateful admirer if he could pull off the murder of Dr. King, even if we establish all those things as undeniable fact, then still there are questions crying out for truthful answers. Who, for instance, provided James Earl Ray with the money he used to travel and purchase cars and cameras and even dancing lessons during his year of freedom following his escape from Missouri Penitentiary and including his murder of Dr. King, his alleged murder? Why was Detective Ed Reddit removed from duty 2 hours before Dr. King was assassinated? And finally, why was the Justice Department investigation permitted to rely so heavily on the findings of the FBI, investigators who, if anything, shared James Earl Ray's awful animosity toward Dr. King and the cause Dr. King did so much to advance, the cause of justice and civil rights? Hopefully, the Congressional Select Subcommittee will now put politics aside and continue its work with a meaningful search for the truth. A great American was brutally murdered, cut down in the prime of his life and in the midst of his mission. And the American people, all of us, deserve to know who all was responsible. We'll be right back after this.